Hello, I'm John Groders, and today on the No Shame podcast, we have a guest that, I'm going to go out on a limb here, is just smarter than the rest of us. Craig Parshall. He's a practical genius. He's the husband of Janet Parshall, and I'll tell you what, it's a great and interesting blessing to hear what he has to say on the No Shame podcast, the intersection of faith and culture.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame.
Hello, welcome to the No Shame podcast. I am John Groders, and I am excited to introduce today Mr. Craig Parshall, a New York Times best-selling author, a columnist, a constitutional attorney, a former senior vice president and general counsel for the NRB, current special counsel for the ACLJ, and basically a man who has a fantastic wife in Janet Parshall. Welcome to No Shame, Craig.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be with you.
I am so excited to talk to you because basically I've been reading The Empowered all morning. So I am halfway through it, and I just want to jump into you wear many hats, but one of them is the hat of a fiction writer. And your most recently published novel, as I understand it, is The Empowered. And it's tell us about this hero of yours. Who is Trevor Black?
Interesting character. I've spent 30-plus years as a trial lawyer and an appellate lawyer, and I've had a chance to meet the good ones, the bad ones, and everybody in between. And I don't mean just in terms of their trial skills. I mean in terms of the personality.
Yeah.
And Trevor Black was a no-holds-barred, victory-at-any-cost guy with really no moral center to his life. Tremendously successful criminal defense attorney is the way I cast him in his character role. He was a New York criminal defense lawyer who almost never lost, and winning was everything. Money was secondary, although he certainly enjoyed it, was very successful, well-heeled, had a trophy wife and a $200,000 car. So he had everything from a worldly standpoint that the world would be impressed with. And he thought his life was on an even keel until it started falling apart little by little. His marriage, his career, and then finally he is put in a position getting more and more desperate where he has this, what he calls a Jimmy Stewart moment. From A Wonderful Life. He's sitting at this bar, Jimmy Stewart was in The Wonderful Life, and he's finally had everything turn upside down to the point where he says, look, basically, God, you got to help me out here. You've got to help me with my crumbling life and rescue me somehow. Well, that was the moment that Trevor Black has, but it was more specific than that. He had been the recipient of a shared gospel from a former client of his who was a guy who ended up spending quite a bit of time in prison, encountered Christ in prison, and then continued a relationship with his former lawyer, Trevor Black. So he had heard the good news and responds to it in a moment of desperation. From that point on, he is given kind of an unusual, burdensome gift, and that is the ability to be able to not just understand that there is a dark kingdom ruled over by the enemy of the kingdom of God, but actually see into it, see what we can imagine perhaps only the Lord Jesus would have been able to see. The rest of us only see the repercussions of evil, but he was able to see, and Trevor Black is given the gift of discernment to be able to visualize what the enemies and his army of demons really look like. This horrifying scene of really the darkest edge of this dark kingdom. Well, when he does, he finds out he's closer to it than he wants to be, and his legal career ends up crumbling as well. So what does he do with his life? Well, he needs to escape. It's his first thought. I need to get out of New York City. Maybe it's just a geographical thing where I'm constantly seeing the demonic influences in the world up here in New York City. I'm going to end up going to an island off of North Carolina, and he goes down there, buys a cabin, retreats from his law practice, cashes everything in, tries to start a new life, but he realizes this gift is permanent, that the demonic realm is not geographical, it's everywhere, and there is a spiritual battle going on, no matter where you are or who you are, that the kingdom of light, ruled over by Christ, and God is at one polar end, and at the other end, of course, is this dark demonic kingdom, and the earth and every inhabitant in between hangs in the balance. So he makes the decision, perhaps this is his new calling. And he ends up responding to that accordingly. And then as he does, he realizes that evil is not just in certain types of crimes. You know, as a criminal defense attorney, he learned the forensic art of unraveling how a crime of violence occurred. And that really is the subject of the first book in the series, The Occupied. But The Empowered, he then looks at this evil of human trafficking. He's really thrust into a realization that is out there. And the fact is, John, as I did more research about human trafficking, I was astounded. I was stunned at how this is an invisible crime occurring in neighborhoods and on playgrounds and around the country that a lot of folks aren't aware of. Well, the bottom line is he gets engaged in this battle, and he brings to bear a spiritual outlook on the fact that human trafficking is not just a crime, it's really a demonic expression of this spiritual battle going on.
We're talking to Craig Parshall, a writer and novelist, and if you are a reader, you know, we read things that are good for us. We can read histories. I like to read all kinds of things, and I'm a sucker for a good novel. And in Craig Parshall, this is my combination. You get a little bit of the law that you might get with a John Grisham novel. You get a gumshoe private eye like you might get with a Robert Parker novel. You get the guy living almost on the boat like a John D. MacDonald, and then you mix in a little Frank Peretti, and you've got this Craig Parshall novel with this hero Trevor Black. I'm telling you what, this is a fun and easy to read story, and I love it. I'm appreciating your speed and the pace of your characters, and how I would say recklessly and fearlessly you throw twists and turns into the story. So purely from the art of it, if you want to read a book that is fun to read, I will confess I haven't finished it. I'm halfway through it, but this is The Empowered, the most recent novel from Craig Parshall. But here's the thing: you're not only telling us a fictional story. You recognize pretty quickly that you are talking some truth to us in these pages of these stories. Let me go to page 246. You wrote this line, and I wrote it down. There's a darkness spreading here, vile, unspeakable, like the pagan days of old. I feel like you're starting to move outside the boundary of fiction a little bit. Could you comment on that? Yeah,
I sense this. As a matter of fact, when a couple of years ago I decided to do this 2-book series involving kind of a supernatural suspense. You know, I've written legal thrillers for years. Of course, from my background as a trial lawyer, that's not unusual and would be expected. But my own experience in terms of my days BC, you know, before a faith encounter with Christ, I was intrigued and really very close to becoming, with an unhealthy sense of interest in the supernatural and the occult. But I put that aside, of course, after my faith encounter with Christ. And I didn't feel the liberty until a few years ago to really address this whole issue of spiritual warfare. The aspect of spiritual warfare can be overemphasized. I remember what C.S. Lewis said, and I think he was right on. He said there are two polar opposites, two wrong ways of looking at this supernatural realm. He said, number one, It's a mistake to be overly interested in it to the point of having an unhealthy appetite. On the other hand, he said, it's just as equally wrong to be oblivious, to blissfully go through life as a follower of Jesus and not understand that there is a spiritual war going on. So we have to strike a balance between the two, and that's what I was hoping that I could do, because the nature of victimization of children, as an example, which was really one of the sub-themes in The Empowered, is something that ought to shock us, ought to rattle our cage out of the complacency of everyday life and understand how vile and vicious the world is becoming. I'll give you an example, John. I had just finished The Empowered, and we were going through some minor revisions before it was released, and a news article came up that the FBI had just finished a national sting operation against those involved in human trafficking of children, not adults, children. They rescued approximately 80 children, ranging from those that were just a few years old to 13 and 14-year-old, and they had been abducted and brought into this vile human trafficking industry, and they arrested dozens and dozens of adults running this human trafficking ring specializing in children. Our fascination with the Internet is understandable because it gives us this convenient opportunity to communicate with people around the world. You know, my wife and I get emails from our friends who are missionaries down in South America. We love the instantaneous connectivity aspect of the Internet. But there's a dark underbelly called the dark web, where human trafficking goes on, where children are literally sold in the dark web back and forth between buyers and sellers. This is unimaginable, and yet it's going on. So I think we need to get below the surface of our immediate, comfortable life and understand that this spiritual battle is no different than the battles that took place so dramatically in the Old Testament, whether it was Elijah or the other prophets, or whether it was some 17 instances, and this is my count. Bible scholars may come with additional examples, but I found 17 examples in the New Testament where Jesus either directly had interaction with demonic forces and vanquished them at every turn, or spoke openly about the reality of the demonic world and its impact on everyday life.
Those two extremes, I mean, so what C.S. Lewis has pointed out, one hand, we pretend it doesn't exist at all. Great Keith Green song, no one believes in me anymore. Dear John, letter to the devil. The other side of it is that we're spending our every moment sort of focusing on the dark side of, and that can pollute our souls and our spirits. The way your fictional character of Trevor Black has encountered as he tries to bring some of this reality of the principalities and powers into the light, and again within the context of the fiction, how is he received by other lawyers and by the world? How do you handle that?
Well, I experienced a little bit of that in law school myself, and of course this was a number of decades ago. But I was in I think it was my second year in law school, and the debate du jour at that time, in terms of issues of law and policy, was whether or not we were going to disband the so-called victimless crime laws like prostitution, and abortion was loaded into it because they didn't deem a preborn child to be a victim at all. The mother was a victim if she couldn't have her option to terminate her pregnancy with abortion. Marijuana, drug cases, and drug offenses, these were all kind of placed into one big basket of victimless crimes, and there were many, many other examples of that. So I was asked to write an opinion piece in our law magazine for our law school, and a professor of philosophy put his case out, and I put my case out for the fact that all law has a moral center to it. Even the most kind of objective, benign, abstract legal provisions in legal codes, at their core, have some ethical aspect to them in terms of how it impacts people and their interactions with other people in society. So at an early stage, I saw this new development in the law and policy and governing where we were saying, no, we're going to disband a couple hundred years, really thousands of years, of the idea that law has as its core the question of right and wrong and morality and immorality, which then raises the question, where do you get your moral code, right? Is it from human speculation and philosophy, or is it from divine revelation? In the Western tradition, most of our laws, the foundation of our legal system, can be traced to the idea of a biblical worldview in terms of the purpose of law. So I saw that early on. But as I continued as a trial lawyer, I realized that we are going farther and farther away from that aspect. In other words, we believe that human beings who have, we believe, invented the fantastic opportunities of technology. We really are the masters of our own ship. We are the gods, small g, of our own environment. And we are the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong and whether there is or is not a spiritual realm. And I think that we have gone so far in believing the lie that could be traced back to the Garden of Eden. Number one, has God really said? And number two, you can be like God yourself. Mm-hmm. I think we've more and more have believed those two aspects, particularly in the law. And in the book, The Empowered, Trevor Black is considered as a guy who believes in the demonic realm and has been disbarred, as you find out in the first book, The Occupied, really because of his belief. His specific belief in the reality of the demonic realm ends up losing his law license. And so he's a pariah, but he's invited to address a convention of lawyers at a big national event where he is met, not surprisingly, with tremendous hostility, practically a riot breaking out as a result of his comments that, look, you lawyers, you judges can't just judge on the empirical, superficial world of what you see and feel and hear, the perceptive world. You have to understand there has to be a moral foundation for the laws we pass and the way in which we dispense justice. And behind morality has to be a source of morality that has to be transcended, i.e., either the biblical worldview or human speculation, which always proves itself to be false.
If you know some of the work that we've done at our company here, we've done a lot of work for Ken Ham in this sort of field of creation versus evolution, and it's taught me quite a bit about the moral code of Darwin or the moral code of survival of the fittest. Would you? So if we don't get a moral code from the divine, from revelation from God, then it's got to come from, like you said, human speculation, which has got to come from somewhere. So if we're just accidents of the Big Bang and some sort of chemical explosion, sound and fury signifying nothing, then what basis for law is there at all?
Well, see, that's the trip box that we get into. In fact, Lewis called it the naturalistic fallacy. If you believe that all there is just what's in nature, what you can see and what you experience viscerally, and of course science is based on experimentation, right? Unless you're in the world of physics, which is a whole other issue, most science is based on some form of observation and experimentation, which means you're really relegated to what you observe. Well, the observed world is only part of the story. And the naturalistic philosophy, fallacy, is that if you believe all there is nature, but you can come up with a transcendent idea about how it works and how it started and what's right and what's wrong, then how are you to be judged? Aren't you judged by the same naturalistic fallacy that you attribute to those that are making judgments on what they don't see? See, the unseen world is what God gives us in His Word, both the visible world and how to live in it successfully and productively, but also the spiritual underpinnings of everything that we do. Well, if you take away the spiritual aspect of it and you just have the physical world, then how can you make a transcendent judgment about whether your philosophy is right, which is a transcendent issue, unless you are godlike? And of course you aren't. You're trapped in the same nature of limited observation as is your judgment. So ultimately you need a transcendent view, or you're doomed to constantly be trapped in a world of appearance rather than reality.
And the world is full of people seeking that, some kind of answer to that transcendence. I mean, we did a couple of documentaries at Delphi in Greece and at Didyma in Turkey. These ancient oracles, for example.
Yeah.
So for 1,000 years, people traveled hundreds of miles to make it to the oracle. Why did they do that? What was going on in those days? Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think in the heart of everyone is a desire for the search of truth. It may find itself at the highest, most abstract level, like the philosophers in ancient Greece, where Paul goes to Areopagus in Acts 17 and engages the greatest minds of that culture, or the average pagan that Paul encountered, who were trapped in superstitions, but constantly gravitating to some higher issue about where truth resides. I think everybody's on that search, and I think I know what the reason is, because in the book of Ecclesiastes, we're told God has placed eternity in our hearts. That is, if there's something in our DNA, there's something in the composite of who we are as humans that God places there from generation to generation, from parent to child, that is a spiritual longing, and of course that spiritual longing is never satisfied. We always search for something else to either satisfy it in terms of our happiness and experience, or satisfy our curiosity that there has to be more to answer why I'm here rather than why I'm not here. Jean-Paul Sartre said the ultimate issue is, why is there anything rather than nothing? I think that was a great question. His answer was wrong, which is, we'll never know because there is nothing out there. But that's the articulated question, and he was right. That longing is everywhere, in everyone. That's why art, film, literature, music, why the expression of the longing for beauty and for truth is, I think, permanent part of the human race. Now what we have to find out is, why is that there? By accident? Or is it an invitation to find out what the answer is? Where does the source of beauty come from? Where is the ultimate standard of truth comes from? And why do we have a need for fellowship for something that's transcendent? Is it an accident of biology, or is it there because it was placed for a reason, so that we would search? We would go on that great journey and find out that, in fact, the search was somebody who was searching for us to have fellowship with him.
Yeah. That's such a great question, and I can imagine Paul, staring at the stars one night, and I think it's in Romans 1. Everything that you need to know about God is evident through what He has created. The fact that there is something, is such a great starting point. But let me ask you this: why? You may even disagree with this premise, but why does it seem, to me anyway, that atheism is so trendy today?
Well, that's an excellent question, John, and it is trendy. But it's also growing. Now, it's not growing in leaps and bounds, but it is significantly growing statistically. Now, you got to start, of course, with the definition of atheism. I was amazed when I read the Pew report and survey of a number of years ago, where it studied the aspect of religiosity of Americans and whether or not we've ceased to become sort of officially denominational like we have been for quite a number of centuries, and whether we're starting to become more spiritual but less religious in the denominational way. And Pew Research found out that more and more people are less inclined to say, I'm a Lutheran, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, I'm an evangelical, or I'm a Baptist, and more inclined to say, I'm spiritual, but I don't want to associate closely with a specific religious creed. Then in that same survey, they disclosed, that is to say, Pew Research, that a number of people who denominated themselves in the survey as atheists also, at the same time, and I think paradoxically, identified themselves as considering themselves to be spiritual. So this idea of being spiritual is now a large tent under which everything from occult practices to forms of paganism, the forms of atheism come under it, because we can't deny, again, that we have this sense of a spirituality, a need to be spiritually connected to something. Even atheists now apparently are describing themselves that way. Now, I should say that there are the ideological atheists, and I've debated a number of them, who would say, no, there's nothing spiritual. It's all empirical. It's only what you can see and perceive, and there's nothing beyond that. And that's the sense of pure reason will give me that answer, that there's nothing beyond what I can see and feel and understand that way. And the hardened, the ideological atheists would tell you that, but they've gone one step farther. They're not just debating. They're now filing briefs in court cases arguing that the newest category of protected class has to be, they say, and I've seen it in briefs in certain church-state cases that I've been involved in, is atheism. Atheism is discriminated against. It is treated hostilely in our culture and by our government. Therefore, it needs special protection, like a protected class, protected from discrimination. So that's the political aspect of this new wave of atheism. But again, the bottom line is that a reasonable position? And I would say it can never be reasonable for reasons that were actually articulated by a skeptic, the famous Scottish skeptic David Hume. I've got his book in my library, and every so often I pull it down to remind myself of this. In his book, David Hume, the world's great skeptic and Scottish philosopher, did say this. He said on his book on miracles, trying to explode the concept of the reasonableness of believing in miracles, he did say the one miracle he really couldn't explain away was the miracle that appeared in the individual lives of Christians who would tell him about their salvation experience and their spiritual awakening. That was something he could not debate away. There was a form of reality in that didn't fit in to his secular skepticism.
You know, these topics are global, universal. The topics we're talking about. Let me take this sort of to our specific country for a moment, America. I've been fascinated lately with American history and this issue of what our country was founded on, what its principles were, who its founding fathers were, because it seems like those are becoming unraveled in some also trendy way. Recently reading David Barton's book, The Jefferson Lies, has completely turned around some of the thoughts that I'd been taught about Jefferson. How do you see the Founding Fathers' intentions for this country, and how do you think they have played out for 250 years?
I think history is a great teacher. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a Supreme Court justice who had a worldview I wouldn't say represented mine, and a number of his judicial decisions, his opinions, were ones that I didn't agree with from a legal standpoint. But he did say one thing that was brilliantly true. Holmes said that a page of history is worth an entire volume of logic. We have so much to learn by learning history the right way. If you look at the founders, they were not all Bible-believing, Jesus-following, born-again Christians in the sense in which I use it as an evangelical. However, there was, as Francis Schaeffer said, there was a Christian consensus. That is to say, the founders, almost every one that we can account, had a Christian worldview. That is to say, they were informed by what the Bible had to say, and if they didn't believe it to be the inherent inspired Word of God and pointing to Christ as the source of all salvation and the only mediator between God and man, they at least accepted the truth of what Scripture had to say about human government, about human beings, about the fact that we are inherently tending toward evil rather than toward good. Now, Jefferson was an optimist. He believed that with the right education that we could pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. John Adams had a different view. He did believe in the inherent sin nature of man, and they disagreed on that. But it's interesting that Jefferson was tremendously tolerant of Christian practices. He, in the very first graduation ceremonies of the University of Virginia, which he founded, he encouraged and agreed to have prayers led during the graduation ceremony, something the Supreme Court back in the 90s said was unconstitutional in public school, and his was a public university. So, you look at the Declaration of Independence and the acknowledgement of who God is in the governance of man is very, very clear. Now, you go to the Constitution, of course, and much is made of the fact that, according to the atheists and the secularists, it is a, quote, godless Constitution. We can argue about that. But then, of course, one of the first rights that Madison wanted to make sure was protected, the Bill of Rights, was the freedom of religion. The reason being that was deemed to be one of the penultimate rights that we need to have because it guides so many others. Where you stand in terms of God determines where you stand in terms of free speech and equal rights and separation of powers and all of these other rights and powers that are set out in the Constitution. But one of the undisclosed facts about the founders is found in a letter from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson in the later years of their life. They had an off-again, on-again relationship. And toward the end, they finally reconciled. And they were both out of office. And they were in private life, and they were getting old. So they had this exchange of letters. And John Adams asked this question, and then he answered it in a letter to Jefferson. He said, what was the common bond that united all those young men and young women who gave their life for this new constitutional republic we call America? What were the binding forces? He said there were two of them. One was the concept of liberty, based on both English concepts of liberty and American concepts of liberty. He said the second bond was the understanding of Christianity. And then he ticked off all the Christian denominations that were represented in the Continental Congress and the Continental Army that went out and shed their blood. Now, if it were an incidental aspect of their worldview, why would he have made such an effort to say, here are all the Christian denominations that were represented by those that gave their blood and their toil and their treasure for the establishment of these rights? So the farther you dig in history about the founders, they differed on some doctrinal issues, but they all had a Christian consensus in terms of their worldview of who God was and the authority of Scripture to give us guideposts in how we manage government and how we manage our life.
Well, we've drifted a fair degree from that, it seems. You bring up the First Amendment and the freedom. Congress shall make no laws establishing an official religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or something like that. Am I close?
Yes, you sure are.
The Establishment Clause. So, how has that become interpreted today?
It was not a problem until the mid-1940s. When the Supreme Court, and this had to do with the composition of justices at that time on the court, and of course the composition of justices on the Supreme Court are a function of elections, as they should be. And that's the way we've got our constitutional fabric knit together in our Constitution, which is the people elect a president nominates justices, and the Senate, also elected by the people, then confirms or denies that nominee. And then once they're on the court, they're judicially independent, supposedly, from the other two branches. So it really is a masterful design, and it usually works pretty well. But the consequences of elections led up to some justices on the Supreme Court that were faced with this idea of separation of church and state, so-called. It's derived from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to a Baptist association that had a concern about whether or not this First Amendment discussion about religion would in fact create government oversight of religion, not an unhealthy alliance between religion and government, but just the opposite, government coming in and supervising and taking away liberties of religion. So Jefferson assured them in his letter that it would have no such effect. But he used the phrase separation of church and state so as to emphasize the protection of church from overreaching by the state, not the vice versa. Well, in the 1940s, the Supreme Court latched onto that phrase in a case called Everson versus Board of Education. And the result was not one that we would probably disagree with. They said, look, there's nothing unconstitutional about parochial schools being able to have their bus fees or the busing transportation assisted by public money, because public education, whether it's private or whether it's public, is a benefit of society, so therefore nothing unconstitutional. So the result was not something that a lot of us would have a disagreement with, but in the process they gave a warning. They said, however, the Constitution in the First Amendment with the Establishment Clause raises this high and impregnable wall between church and state, and nothing is allowed to breach that wall. Well, they gave such a dramatic metaphor, it hung on and still hangs on to this day. It's been criticized by justices of the Supreme Court as really an illogical metaphor that's not based in history, and it doesn't have much logic to it, but it is still there in the jurisprudence of the court, even though they've been chipping away at that wall. They've removed a number of bricks from it. They've created a number of doors in that wall. And eventually they may get to the point and say, it's just a very unfortunate metaphor. Let's get another one to describe the relationship between government and the church or religion and faith. And there have been some recent cases that have been hopeful to indicate that maybe that's where the court is going to have a more realistic, healthy, more founder-oriented view. If we don't like the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause in the First Amendment, both of which protect expressions of faith, then there's a way to do it. The founder said, you amend the Constitution. Short of that, the court's business is not to amend the Constitution, but simply to interpret it.
And it's interesting that that phrase, that separation of church and state, was not original to Jefferson. It was a long bandied about phrase he was referring to. He himself, of course, had nothing to do with writing either the Constitution nor the Bill of Rights, but he somehow has been the poster child for this. My own son kind of got caught up in this, Craig, a few years ago. He was a valedictorian at his high school and was giving the speech, as they do, and the principal called my wife and I in and said, have you seen your son's speech? And we said, no, we haven't. Well, maybe you should take a look. And he handed me his paper, and we hadn't even talked about it as a family. And I'm like, wow, he's plagiarizing. That's Paul. He's going to talk. That's great. Where's that? And he was just going to quote 1 Corinthians 10, 1-13 and sit down. That was all he wanted to say. And he was banned from speaking at that event on the nature that he would violate the Constitution according to the legal opinions of our public schools. Interesting, that particular story kind of caught the press and kind of went viral because he wasn't praying, he wasn't proselytizing, he was just reading Paul of Tarsus's words from which he thought carried truth. And we got calls, possibly, I can't remember, I know the Rutherford Foundation called, ACLJ might have called us too, because it was an interesting case, and they were offering to represent our son all the way to the Supreme Court where this could be decided. And so we got caught in this firestorm, and he was not allowed to speak at his public school because he wanted to quote from the New Testament.
Yeah, that's one of the outer extremes that the school boards and schools have taken the ruling by the Supreme Court, the one I mentioned in the 1990s, Lee versus Weissman, where they held that when a rabbi was selected, it was a private clergyman, was selected to give a prayer at a graduation ceremony that was, by the way, not necessary for graduation. You could take a pass and not attend it if you were an atheist student or an atheist parent. You didn't need it for graduation. It was a voluntary event, but traditional in terms of the agenda for that ceremony, along with the prayer that was pretty universal among high schools at the time. And he gave a pretty benign prayer at the time, and the Supreme Court said, well, no, that's a violation of church and state, because even though the students and parents aren't required to be there in terms of a required captive audience, like you might have in a public school classroom where you have to attend, there was still, Justice Kennedy said, he was the author of that particular decision for the majority, he said there's a psychological coercion because people are really influenced to follow the crowd, to go to the graduation ceremony, because if you don't go, you feel ostracized. And if you do go and you don't stand up in reverent acknowledgement of the prayer and bow your heads and close your eyes, you'll feel ostracized. So there's a psychological compulsion or coercion involved, and therefore that's why it's unconstitutional, which is a ridiculous standard. Justice Scalia pointed out how ludicrous it is to use psychology as a form of coercion. The founders didn't believe in coercion. That was where they drew the line. They said, and you can see it in the debates in the first Congress when they were drafting the words of the First Amendment, they said, particularly James Madison, that they didn't want compulsion or coercion to be the standard. Government could never coerce you to acknowledge a God you didn't believe in, or a different form of doctrine, or any doctrine, against your beliefs. And that was where they drew the line. Well, psychological coercion by saying I feel uncomfortable with the prayer, but I don't know whether to stand or not, that's taking it beyond all reason. So I've seen the court now begin to step slightly back, and again, a result in an election. We have a different composition of the Supreme Court, and a town up in Greece, the town of Greece, New York, had city council prayers. The same challenge was made there, and the court said, no, we don't see any coercion, which I was happy to see, because that really is the standard of the founders. I'm hoping they apply it now to things like graduation ceremonies and other public events.
Well, Jordan Peterson has been talking a lot lately about what has happened to education when you're no longer able to be confronted with thoughts or ideas that might not be your own. And here I am talking to Craig Parshall, an author, a Christian, and in your conversations today, you've quoted John Paul Sartre, you've quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes, you've quoted David Hume. Apparently, you haven't been afraid to read and digest people who, in many ways, you wouldn't agree with. But we're in the educational realm somehow, going to avoid anybody having to confront ideas, which is not a way to strengthen the mind at all.
Yes. Yeah, that's ironic, isn't it, John? That I think if we're apt students of the world, we need to be constantly apt students of the Word. But we need to do both. We need, as Billy Graham used to say, he'd read the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Well, now it's been replaced by social media and the internet, but the point is to know what's going on. Paul understood the philosophies of the pagan philosophers to the point where he could quote pagan poets in his dialogue with the great philosophers of Athens in Acts 17. So he was schooled. It didn't mean he believed it, but he had to know where the other side was coming from in order to in a winsome way, make the best case possible for the truth of Scripture and who Jesus was. Now, of course, the philosophers in Acts 17 cut him off when he got to the resurrection, because they went, people don't rise. Okay, that's enough. We've heard enough. That's their choice. But our choice has to be educated, culturally, intellectually educated in the affairs of the day, in the news of the day, in what the so-called great thinkers, the speculative thinkers, the political thinkers, the social thinkers are thinking about, so we can contend effectively for the faith. So we really need to do both. It's always easier, to work with one pedal on a bike than two. But I think that option's not left to us. I think the Lord wants us to do both.
Wow. Well, to contend effectively for the faith. I mean, Paul before the Areopagus, a fantastic example, and he fared better than Socrates in some ways. At least they were willing to to hear more from him, and they didn't give him the hemlock. You have chosen
there you go.
fiction as a way to contend, and I just want to recommend, if you're listening to this, you've certainly, if you've been with us listening to one, this is one of the great minds in our country, and I just appreciate how quickly you can jump from topic to topic and speak with authority and truthfulness. But if you don't, if you aren't a regular person who's reading John Paul Sartre or David Hume at home, and yet you think this is fascinating, your books give us an access point. And the Empowered, again, I can't wait to finish it. It's great. If you like a good novel, you're going to have these topics. They're going to resonate in your mind, and it's going to be easy to read. We are trying to do it with making films. Craig, I'm about to launch America Studios, where we are going to make films about these stories of American foundings in the same way, contend the faith in a way that's entertaining and it's engaging and is not didactic by the power of film. And your wife was just saying to me the other night, we were talking about my most recent film, which is called Tortured for Christ. And she was saying, I am so partial to film because it is an embodiment of all the arts. And I laughed because she said she was partial. Really kind of a funny joke. But the point she was making was a great one, and I think she is saying we can contend for the faith by using the arts, and that's an avenue available to us. So I appreciate what you've done with the writing and how you bring you bring so much to the table. And maybe you can close with this. Why do you write fiction? What has been the reason that you put the time and effort into that?
Well, there's more than one reason for it. One is a real basic aspect of a writer's life, and that is you either want to be a storyteller or you don't. And I have always I wanted to be a storyteller. I originally was going to be heading toward professional theater as an actor and doing the storytelling of other people and living out characters. I was raised in a theater family, and the Lord directed me in a different way toward law. But I always had a desire to be in the storytelling business because I loved the artistry of it. But the second and more important reason is because the greatest storyteller of all time was Jesus. He was a great short storyteller.
Yes, succinct.
They were called parables back then. And he took universal truths and he put them in very common, practical little stories that people could relate to. And that's the enterprise that I like to be in because I know that people like storytelling. In fact, John, being in the film business, you are really in one of the businesses that science says is the most engaging to the human brain. Because I read recently a report from scientific studies that says that the human brain processes image 60,000 times quicker than they do reading words on a page. So there is a gateway to the brains and minds of human beings through film and imagery. Now, much of it, as you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, has gone the wrong way. The imagery and the storytelling adjacent to the imagery is telling the wrong kind of story. But it's a powerful tool. So may your tribe increase in terms of the use of film and movies to tell stories in a powerful way that competes with the expertise and excellence out there in the secular film business, but does it from a worldview that brings people an understanding of God in the world that they live in.
I think it's 60,000 times more expensive to do it that way, but I'm glad to hear it's 60,000 times more effective.
By an exponential of 10 or 20. Yes, I'd say so.
Well, this has been No Shame Podcast with John Groders and our guest, Craig Parshall. And, man, just a fascinating person. If this is the first time you've met or heard from Craig Parshall, go to his website, Parshall, and you'll be able to find about his books and the things that he does. Craig, thank you for your time. I'm just fascinated by getting a chance to talk to you, and thank you for joining us. I hope people listening to this have appreciated a conversation that is about the deeper things, how we got to be who we are today as a country, as a people, and as a basic understanding of God or not God. Do all things exist for a reason or not? We've touched on it all. Craig, thank you for joining us.
Oh, John, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Have no shame. No, we are not afraid. No shame. On the gospel of His name, it's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid. Say